Hi, this is Josh Kulp for Daf Shevui. We are learning Daf Mem of Masechet Avodah Zarah. It is always a pleasure to be learning with you. And this is the final daf of this chapter, of the second chapter of Masechet Avodah Zarah, so it's very exciting. I hope you enjoy it. One thing I wanted to reflect on in this video is the nature of observing the laws of kashrut back then versus the nature of observing the laws of kashrut as we live it today. Most people who live today, when you keep kosher, at least in America, North America, pretty much in Israel as well, and probably in other countries as well, what shopping is like for somebody who keeps kosher is constantly looking at the package to see if somebody has given a hechsher, an okay to it. And the same is true for many people who keep kosher when they go out to restaurants or when they buy food in other places. They always have to ask, did somebody else, did a rabbi, did somebody who's knowledgeable, okay, allow me to eat this food? Well, mashgichim, people who supervise kashrut, did not exist in the Talmud. There is no such thing as such a position, and there doesn't seem to have been kosher sellers. There weren't restaurants. It didn't exist in the ancient world. Kosher inns. Jews lived in a world where they would have had to constantly buy food products from non-Jews and ask themselves, how do we know if it's kosher? Now, obviously, sometimes it wouldn't be kosher. Jews weren't buying, kosher Jews weren't buying pig meat from non-Jews, but and they probably weren't buying already slaughtered meat because that would have had to have been slaughtered by a Jew. But what about things like fish? What about things like eggs? What about all sorts of other products that may or may not have forbidden ingredients in them? How did Jews know that they were kosher? And they just had to make certain assumptions. To a certain extent, either act strictly or do the best that they could. So we've talked about this with regard to fish. Our Gemara begins to talk about identifying fish that hasn't been fully chopped up, right? We said fully chopped up fish you can't buy from Gentiles because it might not be kosher. But fish that has been partly chopped up and you can still recognize some of the fish in it, you may be able to buy that. The question is, how much of the fish needs to be recognized? Does the whole body have to be recognized such that you can see that it has fins and scales? Or is it sufficient to recognize just the head and that you could identify that it's a kosher fish just from the head? If there's a lot of fish in this fish brine or this fish mince, and one of them is recognizable as a kosher fish, but we can tell that not all of the fish in this mixture are that one particular fish. So how do we know? I mean, they don't all come from that one specific fish. How do we know that, let's say, one kosher fish is a sign that all of the fish were kosher? Another question, if you're buying fish from a boat, and they've already been chopped up some, but you see scales are outside the boat, can you assume that all the fish that were in the chopped up fish are kosher? You'll see the discussion of all of this in the Gemara. The same thing kind of discussion occurs with fish intestines and fish roe, the caviar, the eggs. Can we tell that they came from a kosher fish? There's I found interesting discussion, at least on the caviar. Not something, to be honest, that I've ever eaten, but who knows? It doesn't sound appetizing to me. But there is the assumption that kosher fish lay external eggs, and non-kosher fish, they have eggs, all fish have eggs, but that they incubate them inside their bodies and that they are hatched more or less live. That is true, by the way, of many non-kosher fish, such as sharks and rays. It also would be true of whales and dolphins, although I don't know if rabbis are categorizing them as fish. But or at least not fish that they were dealing with eating them. So it is not true that only kosher fish lay eggs. There are non-kosher fish that also lay eggs, but you can see where the rabbis might ask the question, if we have an egg, maybe all fish eggs are all kosher because they all must come from kosher fish. There's also a piece about identifying how can you tell if an egg comes from a kosher bird. Let's say the egg has been separated from the bird. Is there something distinctive about the shape of bird's eggs and by extension fish egg, although they're so much smaller that I don't know how you can tell some of these things. just from its shape that you could tell it comes from a kosher fish. So those are interesting discussions. Again, more than the particulars of how to do this, because most of you will never face such situations. If you keep kosher, you mostly just buy something from a kosher butcher or something where somebody else has told you that they've watched the processing of it and they know that it's kosher. But it's interesting to note that this didn't happen in the ancient world. One final note that's sort of on the same issue is that there's a question of how do we know the ingredients that were put into something behind our backs when we're not watching. The question here is particularly, did wine get put into things? There seems to have been a practice to flavor things up with wine, such as locusts, which could be eaten. Most Jews do not eat them anymore, but there are theoretically locusts that Jews can eat. How do we know that the seller, who is not a kosher seller, not a Jew, didn't sprinkle a little wine into his locusts, right? Notice these are all things that don't require shechting. They don't require Jewish slaughter. Fish, birds' eggs, and locusts are all things that you might end up buying from a non-Jew because he doesn't have to slaughter them. Whereas, let's say, meat from a bird or the meat of an animal, it would be more difficult to buy directly from a non-Jew because you have to assume that if the non-Jew is selling it to you, he slaughtered it. And so that you don't find as many discussions about. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this chapter, and we're going to move on next week to a brand new chapter with a whole different subject, and I'm sure you'll enjoy that as well.